What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm talking about heroic whistleblower Daniel Hale, who leaked important documents to the Intercept about the drone program and has now been sentenced to 45 years in prison. Also, going to be talking about a Senate plan to draft women and the U.S. military buildup against China and new war games that we have going on. So, all that and more in today's show. Be sure to share it. You can find it at the Libertarian Institute. It's where the show is hosted. The URL is libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show and the daily news roundup that I write. You can also find the show on any of our social media accounts at Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. We put the video version of the show up at Rumble, Odyssey, and YouTube. The show for audio version of podcasts is up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. You could donate to the show at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you could also help the show out and get some financial money going to the show and get yourself some great CBD products by doing your CBD shopping at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Again, the URL is PalomaVerdeCBD.com, and when you check out, you use the promo code PEACE to get yourself 25% off orders of $75 or more. They have a great lineup of products at Paloma Verde. So if you're into soft gels, gummies, tinctures, they have all that for you. But I really like the topicals they have over at Paloma Verde. They're long lasting, they work quickly, and the bottles that they sell last for a long time. It's not like you need half a bottle to get any pain relief. Just one little pump of their sports cream will help my back out for the day. So really recommend all their products over there at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. But I really like their topicals. Whatever you get, use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, to get yourself 25% off when you spend $75 or more. Now let's get into the show, talking about Daniel Hale, the heroic whistleblower. Now, maybe if you meet Daniel Hale, don't lead like that, because he seems to, have some confliction about what he did, before leaking the documents that eventually, blew up the Obama drone program and helped to expose that, his administration was acting as judge, jury, and executioner, and oftentimes killing civilians, not just the intended targets of the strikes. And Hale, went beyond just being a whistleblower and leaking documents, but has, since provided a lot of commentary on the drone program, including in the great documentary National Bird, which me and Will Porter actually talked about in one of our first episodes, first time I interviewed him on Foreign Policy Focus, my old podcast. So, Daniel Hale is an incredibly important figure. Me and Will certainly feel like his role in the drone program, leaking that, and then appearing in National Bird helped us to understand how nefarious this program is, how much it hurts the people overseas, but also the American soldiers who are involved in it. So there's a couple articles I'm talking about here. One is titled "Call Me a Traitor." It's by Carrie Howley and in the New York Magazine. And so I have that up right now on the screen. There's also a letter that Daniel Hale wrote to the judge before his sentencing that I'm going to reference some here, and that was published at the Gray Zone and the Dissenter. The Dissenters, Kevin Gostola's great website. So just kind of getting into the story of who Daniel Hale is. He talks about growing up and struggling with his very religious father. After high school, he tried a few different things. Went to New York, tried to sell magazines, went to Las Vegas and tried to become a dealer. I think he was from kind of the Appalachia area, so I'm sure, these places were all quite exotic and different to him. But everywhere he went, he seemed to fail and end up back at home. It seemed like one of the messages that his father really imparted in Hale was that one of the ways to have some success, get some status, make some money, not be a failure, for somebody who comes from Daniel Hale's family, where it doesn't seem like there's a lot of money there, it would be to join the military. And so eventually, at the age of 21, he ends up in the Air Force. For all the things in this article to talk about, essentially everything else that Daniel Hale has tried, it seems like he's kind of failed at. And I'm not trying to insult the guy or anything, but he's been fired as a dishwasher, failed out of school, stuff like that. But he did apparently ace his test, to enlist in the army, and really had his pick at what he wanted to do. And at the time, he talked about being somebody who watched Democracy Now!, kind of believing in the Obama message. This is about 2008. We're talking about that he's joining the Air Force. And, by 2010, he comes to realize that Obama is a clown and a fraud, he says. But back then, believing that this is the guy that's going to shut down Guantanamo Bay, not what he ends up doing, keeping Guantanamo Bay open and waging this massive drone war across the entire Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. So anyways, Hale is in the military. One of the things he does is signed up to learn Chinese, and in, I believe, 2012 is when he ends up getting first deployed to Fort Bragg for some classes, and worked with JSOC there. And then, there he talks about the first thing they learned about was cell phones. And then he gets deployed to Afghanistan in 2012, where he is working on it seems like the tech end and the input end of the drone program going on there, where they're talking about tracing cell phones and using those cell phones to blow up targets. He talks about that it's not his job necessarily to be there when the missile blows up, right? Like he wasn't necessarily supposed to see that, but apparently he did. And he has some particular stories that if you read either his letter or this article in New York Magazine, you'll understand that he was scarred by what he saw during this experience. Now, after he gets out of the military, I guess this is probably around like end of 2012, 2013, he ends up with an opportunity, or excuse me, no, this is he gets out of the military in 2013, and in 2013 he sees Jeremy Scahill in April, and then speaks alongside him in June of 2013, and that that's where they get in contact, I guess. After leaving the Air Force, he tries a couple of different things, and it doesn't work out. So he needs work, he needs money, he wants to go back to school. And in 2014, he gets a offer to work at I think it's Leadis. It's a Pentagon contractor that apparently assigned him to the National Geospatial Intel Agency. I think the NGA is the acronym. It's actually one of the biggest, kind of Pentagon Washington agencies that exist. They're looking to map everything. And so while there, he was, I guess, mapping a whole bunch of things that he said were already publicly available on Google Earth. But he got hired to do that and was making pretty good money. He had some moral issues with the job, making the money through the Pentagon. And so one of the things he promised himself in the beginning is that he would only do this for a few months. Now, in February of 2014, some of his workers, I guess, get him to start accessing and watching what you would call war porn, different drone strikes and stuff like that, where people die. Of course, I think his coworkers are people who kind of cheered on, rah rah, America's blowing up the bad guys. This is the kind of stuff that we get to watch because we're special and have clearance. Where Hale is, I think, more scarred by this and traumatized by it. And so he ends up on February 8th, 2014, starting to print documents and then contacts Jeremy Scahill. And this continued through August, where he smuggled documents out of this agency, which is an intelligence agency and did have tight security. Apparently, Hale had to be or could have been searched several times. And so what he was doing is he was, I guess, like printing the documents out and then putting them in his belt line and using that to get out. Now, the other thing he did is he actually smuggled the documents back in, and I guess that made him feel more secure that the government wouldn't necessarily be looking for him or something like that, if the documents were turning back up and being shredded as they should be. So again, this goes on for several months, and the Intercept, in July, the Intercept started to publish documents that were involved, that Hale leaked, and with the drone papers coming out in October of that year. Now, on August 8th of 2014, Hale leaves his job at the contractor and ends up, leaving his job then at the National Geospatial Intel Agency. And when he did, he goes home, and the cops show up at the place where he's living. I guess it's like a friend of his mother lives in like a mansion. She has an extra room. He's living there. I'm not even sure if the guy's paying rent, but he's probably quiet. He keeps to himself. And then the feds come and they absolutely tear her place apart. They question her. She's absolutely devastated and confused. I guess because it's national security, he really can't tell the woman what's going on. He feels embarrassed, so he leaves. And then he goes and talks to a lawyer, finds out there's not an existing indictment against him. And from that time in 2014, I believe all the way until May of 2019, Hale doesn't have any more contact with the police, despite the drone papers being published, him appearing in the Great National Bird documentary, several other whistleblowers going to jail during this time, but Hale doesn't end up in jail. So then it isn't until May of 2019. And in the meantime, I guess, other than appearing in National Bird, Hale had mostly worked as a dishwasher in Nashville. This is, just interesting, the New York Magazine part. He really struggled as a dishwasher. He got fired from everywhere he worked at. And it wasn't because, he was showing up drunk or not showing up for a shift, but rather he would show up, encourage his employees out to unionize, as push people to ask for more money, things that management didn't want. But also, I could see fellow coworkers not necessarily responding well to, why don't you get a raise? Like some people don't want to be pushed, and so maybe not the best social skills. He also would apparently like come into work sometimes and like try to repair things that either didn't need to be repaired, or the company wants to repair. They don't want the dishwasher to come in with his own tools and repair the dishwashing machine. They're going to call their contractor that's going to come in and do it, because he's licensed or whatever like that. So Hale ends up getting fired from just about everywhere he's ever worked, and that continues until May of 2019, when he's fired from his job. He goes, I guess, ends up having drunk sets with a woman, and then returns home, and in the early hours, probably still a little bit drunk, he gets picked up by 6 feds, completely armed. They came out like a SWAT team from the bushes, it sounds like, and even the feds probably realized that was a little bit of overkill, according to Hale's narrative. And he gets charged with violation of the Espionage Act, and in March 2020 pleads guilty to several counts. I guess kind of on the idea that if he pleads guilty, he would be able to get a reduced sentence. Now, he did plead guilty, but then the government sought, I believe, 11 years for him in prison anyways, which would have been one of the more extreme convictions under the Espionage Act. So after Hale pled guilty in April of, I believe, 2021, but it may have been 2020. I think it was 21, though. His bail was revoked because his psychiatrist told his parole officer that he was worried that Hale could be a danger to himself or others. And so at the ultimate betrayal of a doctor, Hale was then subject to go to prison, which I'm sure only exacerbated any mental health problems that he had. And then just today, July 27th, the day before this runs, Hale was sentenced to 45 months in prison. I believe he does get time served under that, so I'm not exactly sure how many days that he's wrapped up so far, but it's 3 years and 9 months. Maybe it gets down to about 3 years with time served, maybe quite a bit less than that, again depending on how much of this time he's been in prison, and then of course, hopefully, knock a couple months off. Daniel Hale doesn't seem like the kind of guy that's going to get into, any kind of definitely physical trouble in prison. Maybe he'll try to, organize some kind of prison and food strike or something like that and end up having to do the whole sentence because of some kind of activism like that. But that is, I think, the general outline of the story of Daniel Hale. A couple other things I thought were interesting about his story is that while the Army or the Air Force, I guess, trained him in Chinese, it wasn't even something he used until he worked for the defense contractor. And so that seemed like it would have been a big waste of money on the government's part. He also said that, I believe in 2010, an officer came into wherever he was at the time, maybe Fort Meade, and told them that they couldn't look up the name WikiLeaks, and that doing so would result in them potentially losing their security clearances. A couple other interesting notes. There's a great thread by Kevin Gustola that he put together on his Twitter, K Gustola, where he points out kind of the story of Daniel Hale he gets into. But one of the things that was really disturbing is that the prosecution alleged that the documents that Hale put out, that Hale exposed, were used by ISIS to gain some kind of advantage, and that this should factor into the sentencing. Now, I'm not sure if the judge actually bought this. I don't know. Again, the government was looking for quite a bit more time than Hale got, so maybe not. But it's not that ISIS actually benefited from this. And in fact, Harry Cooper, a former CIA executive, expert for classification, who trained top officials, disputed the claim that ISIS gained some kind of advantage. An adversary who has gained tactical advantage by receiving secret information would never publicize their possession of it, because the government said that ISIS publicized that they got one of these documents, that was their point. And so that was pretty clearly debunked. One of the disturbing things about this is that Hale was allowed to be under the threat of being arrested at any time for years and years, but wasn't prosecuted throughout the Obama years for this, which is, the administration that this, seemingly would have embarrassed more, and then wasn't, prosecuted until we got into the Trump administration. But it was the Biden administration that has continued with this and gone ahead with the sentencing. Biden could have pardoned Hale. His Department of Justice could have recommended a lighter sentence, not the strictest ever espionage act sentence, and instead went the strict route on this one. So just, this isn't a Trump thing, it's not a Biden thing, it's not an Obama thing. This is the U.S. state at its absolute worst. And again, I really recommend people check out the letter that Daniel Hale wrote. I think you'll get more insight than I gave into his personality and how he really feels about the U.S. military, having to have been a part of the military machine, this awful drug program that has killed so many people. And also somebody who I think suffers from moral injury. You'll get to see maybe a little bit of that, which I think is useful, and just how awful the drone program is. If you're not interested in reading, it is in the New York Magazine write-up and his letter are quite long. Check out National Bird. At least you'll get to see some of Daniel Hale in that. And again, one important figure that Daniel Hale is, he really is a hero and should be let out of jail. And we should really be focused on imprisoning our, war criminals like Cheney and Bush and stuff like that. All right, moving on to the new Senate plan to draft women. I guess the draft is bumping into the issue. The Supreme Court has even kind of mentioned that, if Congress didn't take this up, then maybe they would look at the issue. But making men only register for the draft is essentially a sexist policy at this point, because women qualify for every role in the military that men do. Now, if you're a women's rights activist and you're arguing that the draft should only apply to men, you could point out that the Pentagon is a sexual assault slash rape factory. It's a huge issue there, an epidemic. They really don't have a handle on it. The Biden administration introduced some new kind of weak regulations, and so I think there's still cases to be made for women specifically not to qualify for the draft, just because I think they could argue that it puts them at a sharp increase risk that they would be subject to like a rape or sexual assault, and very likely that their perpetrator would not be held in any way responsible for that. But just kind of focusing on the current arguments that people are looking at, because that really doesn't enter into the public discussion. Yeah, they're very hush hush on that unless they're kind of talking about a Me Too issue, and that is that they're having to deal with the issue: do we get rid of the draft or do we expand it to women and just have everybody be involved in the draft? I would assume that when they said expand it to women, they really mean to expand it to everyone, and they wouldn't necessarily be I guess excluding people who identify with other than binary choices, but I have no idea how the military would handle that situation. Anyways, the Senate Armed Services Committee, in a closed door hearing, very interesting that they decided to do this. I believe Rhode Island Democrat Jack Reed is the chair of this committee, approved a amendment to the Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act. This is for year 2022, that amends the Military Selective Service Act to require the registration of women for selective service. Now, I guess it'll be interesting if they'll make sure that the penalties that apply to men for not signing up for selective service would apply to women, or if this is something that women should do, but let's say they won't face losing financial aid to college, driver's licenses, fines, potential jail time for not signing up for the draft. So that's kind of most of what we have as far as what's happening. I don't think it's in the House version of the NDAA, at least not yet, and so that this could be a conference committee issue. It seems like it would be a very sleight of hand trick of Congress to pass this as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the funding bill for the Pentagon, which every year they argue that, we can't not in any way risk not funding this bill because it would leave us defenseless and our troops unpaid and all these other terrible things would happen. And so the Congress isn't even brave enough to actually vote on the issue. They're just trying to kind of sneak it in back door. And again, I think this is largely a way for Congress to not really have to deal with the issue that the draft is sexist against men, and they should have to really deal with a bill that either expands the draft or eliminates that, although that would be tough votes for all the congressmen. Now, of course, my position is hell no on the draft. We shouldn't be expanding it to women. It should be abolished. It could be abolished in any number of ways. The president could say we're not enforcing it anymore. Congress could, write in a bill and then pass it and say that we're abolishing the draft. The courts could strike it down because it's essentially slavery, where you're taking away somebody's free choice. You're either saying your choices now are prison, or you're going to go to another country and potentially kill somebody else or be killed yourself for a mission that you may or not believe in or care about at all. And so that's why, we absolutely have to oppose the draft. We have to oppose this. If it starts to move forward and gain some momentum, I'll definitely talk about it on the show more. At this point, again, we're only at the conference committee level of the Senate version of the NDAA for this. However, again, if we expand the draft to everyone, that's really going to hamper one of the main arguments against it, which is that it's sexist. And rather than, coming up on the end of the draft in the United States, we could actually be looking at extending it decades into the future if the Senate moves and the Congress moves forward, and of course Biden passes this. Interesting story that's gained a lot of attention. The U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs becomes the first federal agency to require healthcare workers get the COVID vaccine. Now, this, I'm not going to be commenting on this at all. I want to make that very clear from a medical standpoint. I think there's a civil liberties argument to have here, that whether the vaccine is effective or not, whether it's safe or not, that, what we should, be talking about is the fact that people should have more of a choice over what they put in their own bodies. Of course, the Department of Veterans Affairs is going to require this before any of these vaccines even have widespread approval from the FDA. And then, of course, talk to a lot of people who are concerned about taking a vaccine for a number of reasons. One of them would be, a lot of different medications that you're on. Say, you shouldn't take a vaccine, or you should talk to your doctor about taking a vaccine if you're on this medication. And so people could, be forced off of medication that is in some way, other way helpful to them to get a vaccine for an illness that, they may or may not personally be concerned about. And so, people should have the choice over whether to get the vaccine or not, and working for the VA shouldn't necessarily disqualify you from that choice. I guess, there's also arguments that should be had over whether, the natural immunity from having COVID in the past should either exempt you, or maybe for an X amount of time that you should get some kind of exemption. It seems that, it's very odd that the VA isn't even considering that if you have a natural immunity, that you shouldn't then have to also get the vaccine. Now, there's a couple issues. They say one of those is that they're concerned about spreading it to their clients who are older and sicker. However, today I was just seeing a post that from the Washington Post saying that the CDC was finding that people who have the vaccine and who get COVID are just as likely to spread it. Now, they're not as likely themselves to get as sick, but the VA is just worried about spread. I don't know if everybody getting vaccinated even matches with the current data that we have, and if that's really a step to prevent the spread to people. Now, another interesting thing noted in this article is there was recently an outbreak of COVID at the VA Law Enforcement Training Center, and that's one thing that everybody should remember, is that the VA is a federal agency with its own law enforcement arm. And I'm not sure if they're actually going to require their law enforcement or just their doctors to get vaccinated, but they apparently have 70% vaccination anyways. They're going to require 115,000 healthcare workers, so I guess that wouldn't probably require the law enforcement, but maybe if they worked in a facility, they would then be required. Unclear on that, but they're going to require 115,000 people to have the vaccine. Again, 70% of those people already have it, but those additional 30%, those 30,000 plus people, are now going to be required to have it in the coming weeks. And this is seeming to be a trend, as New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that all workers, city workers in New York City, roughly 340,000 of them, would be required by the middle of September, or they would have to be tested daily, or weekly, excuse me. They would have to be tested weekly for COVID. And so this is kind of reminding me of something said by the CNN doctor. I forget her name, but she's saying that they want to make it uncomfortable for people who haven't gotten vaccinated, and one of the ways to do that is to require constant testing. So a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And again, I'm not trying to tackle this from a medical standpoint. Just I have some questions about if getting the vaccine would really reduce the your chance of spreading it, which the CDC is now saying that they're not so sure about that. And then also to say I think this is a civil liberties issue. Now let's look at some things going on in Venezuela, where Venezuela is accusing the U.S. of violating its airspace. It says a U.S. C-17 flew over Venezuela's Persian Mountains in the western Zuli state for 3 minutes on Thursday evening. This would have crossed over from the border with Colombia. So, this isn't coming off the coast. This is crossing over from Colombia. I'm sure Venezuela also views Colombia somewhat responsible for this, increasing tensions between neighbors. But this is just another provocative thing the U.S. is doing towards Venezuela, going on with the maximum pressure campaign that the Biden administration is refusing to end. A couple stories on North Korea here. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Deputy Secretary of State, that is Wendy Sherman, said the U.S. has offered dialogue with North Korea. And she said, we have offered to sit and dialogue with the North Koreans and are waiting to hear from them. I'm not sure when, she made this overture. The most recent overture made by the Biden administration was met with skepticism from the North Korean side, saying that unless you're offering some kind of different negotiation, not North Korea must denuclearize, then we're not going to engage in talks. And there's no indication that the U.S. is actually changing any of their positions with North Korea. They're just saying that they want to engage in talks with the North Koreans. And I think it's very possible that what the Biden administration is just trying to do is create a narrative where we're trying everything we can with the North Koreans, but they're just absolutely impossible to deal with. They won't negotiate with us, and so we gotta give up and continue in this hostile position, when in reality the U.S. is just coming back to the North Koreans, offering the same thing as before, which North Korea would be foolish to say yes to, because Kim Jong-un saw what happened in Libya. All right, but there is some positive news on the Korean front when we're just looking at diplomacy between the two Koreas. They reopened a dormant hotline between the two countries and held several conversations on those lines. It had been offline for over a year when North Korea, they blew up some kind of joint center with South Korea, and then they cut off the line because the United States, despite saying that they were willing to engage in talks with North Korea, ended up just kind of pulling the same old thing and saying that North Korea must denuclearize and give up everything up front. And so all the positive steps taken by North and South Korea, North Korea and the United States during the Trump administration fell apart towards the end of the Trump administration. Now, the Biden administration could have a chance to start something new, but they've essentially said that they're more or less sticking with the Obama policy, where we're going to continue to offer North Korea talks if they agree to denuclearize, but North Korea is not going to denuclearize without a massive change in the U.S. policy towards North Korea. Minus they might not be willing to do it. However, they may agree to some cuts and curbs on their nuclear program in exchange for the U.S. Release and sanctions. So I believe that's all we have on these on the North Korea thing. Moon Jae-in, the leader of South Korea, did say that him and Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, have been exchanging letters for several months, and for whatever reason, letter writing seems to be a good way of diplomacy with the North Korean leader. Moving on to talk about U.S. and Russia, they're going to be holding some arms talks in Geneva starting this coming week. Don't have a lot of details on exactly what's going to be discussed here. The New START treaty was extended at the beginning of the Biden administration, so that's good. But that is a 5-year extension, and these treaties take a long time to negotiate. So if the U.S. would like to do something rather than just continue to extend New START, but work on an agreement that furthers to eliminate nuclear weapons, different classes, kinds of nuclear weapons, maybe something like ICBMs, we could hold these talks with Russia and have that be a result. We'll note that this is building on diplomacy. This is something that came as a result of Biden and Putin's meeting in the middle of June. Now let's talk about China, where rather than diplomacy, the U.S. is engaging in aggression and shows of force. The U.S. is launching its new Pacific war games called Pacific Iron 21, and it is going to contain a record amount of stealth aircraft, at least 25 F 22s and 10 F 15s, as well as two C 130J refueling tankers. And what the point of this mission is, I guess, is there's a whole bunch of runways on smaller islands in the Pacific Ocean, and the U.S. wants to make sure that it could launch and land all of its fighter aircraft from these islands. That way, if China would ever to try to, or the U.S. would end up at war with China, they would have more targets they would have to hit to reduce the U.S. presence in the region. Now, there's a lot of logistical problems with this, including several of these islands that the U.S. is talking about are so far away from the South China Sea, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, that the U.S. would need the mid-air refueling. Also, these runways are very small, and you can't land the refueling tankers on them. You can't land massive cargo planes on them. And so, if the U.S. is looking to use these airstrips as anything more than just landing and taking off, and for what purpose, to repair the planes and all that, it seems they would have to deploy more assets. But this is a part of the U.S. military buildup in the Pacific, and this is targeting a potential war with China. Massive number of bases and little islands we're talking about around the Guam area of the Pacific. While this is going on, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is traveling to Southeast Asia, where he's going to visit Singapore, the Philippines, and Vietnam. He's going to be talking with all these countries about China being a priority threat in the region, and what these countries are going to do and how they're going to work with the U.S. to combat the Chinese threat. In particular, in the Philippines, Austin will likely be discussing the Visiting Forces Agreement, which is the treaty that allows U.S. troops in that country. There's some issues between the U.S. and the Philippines with this, mainly resulting from, I think, the erratic nature of Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, who at one point was going to scrap the VFA with the U.S. and look to maybe be a little bit closer to China. At the time, the U.S. was being pretty critical of the Philippines because of the drug war that Duterte was waging in his country. They were killing a lot of innocent people, basically accused of using drugs. That was enough to get you assassinated. And so, there was some issues, and the Philippines kind of reached out to China and I think was rebuffed, and now the Philippines is having an issue in some of its fishing grounds where it says that China is encroaching on them. Now, if you look at the Chinese territorial water claims in the South China Sea, they do seem rather large, but the U.S. shouldn't be concerning itself with what these countries are doing, and if they're all concerned about what China is doing, they should concentrate on their own, on banding together, and the U.S. shouldn't be involved in this. We shouldn't be concerned about having a visiting forces agreement with the Philippines. We should be trying to cut ties with that country, again, whose leader is committed a lot of human rights abuses. Last week on the show, I talked about China being hit with sanctions over the U.S. alleging Hong Kong human rights abuses in Hong Kong. China responded to the U.S. sanctions by issuing sanctions against the U.S., including Trump official Wilbur Ross. While that was going on, the U.S. is sanctioning China. China is retaliating against the U.S. with sanctions. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman met with top Chinese diplomats on Monday in China to discuss the relationship between the two countries. The State Department described the conversation as a frank and open discussion. It's probably better that this occurred behind closed doors rather than the debacle that we saw in Alaska in March when Blinken met with the Chinese foreign minister, and the two countries traded fairly hostile statements. And so the State Department says it raised concern with China over Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, the South and East East China Seas and other areas. It seems like a whole bunch of things that have absolutely nothing to do with the U.S. people or the U.S. government. It may be that China is doing terrible things to some of these people. It doesn't seem like, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Xinjiang coming under more control of the kind of Chinese Communist Party would increase freedom. At the same time, U.S. intervention, U.S. military buildup in the region really isn't creating any additional freedom either, and we're not able to prevent China from controlling territories that are, close, are historically Chinese. Well, that doesn't mean the West and is going to give up on its efforts to try to tell China to do right off of, or even almost a part of the Chinese mainland, with the UK's new aircraft carrier, the HMS Elizabeth, entering the South China Sea. The HMS Queen Elizabeth is with the carrier strike group, is also with the HMS Defender, which recently also entered the South China Sea after it was, messing around off the coast of Crimea, provoking warning shots being fired from Russian ships at the HMS, well, not at the HMS Defender, but, enough to deter that ship from its current path. And so, this is more provocative action from the U.S. and its allies in the South China Sea. Want to update what's going on in Ethiopia a little bit, where fighting is continuing to rage and get worse in that country. On the last show, I talked about so we got to go back a little bit here to November of 2020, when the Ethiopian government, alongside the Eritrean army and allied ethnic militias in Ethiopia, went to war against the Tigray fighters. The Tigray is a region of Ethiopia. The Tigrayan people are an ethnic group, and they had a militia and a somewhat autonomous area. The government, along with these fighters, went in and routed the Tigrayan ethnic militia called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. And for several months, it seemed the Ethiopian government was in control of the region, although there's reports of war crimes and abuses going on. Just a month or so ago, the Ethiopian government announced it withdrew its troops from the area. The Eritrean troops are gone, and it declared a ceasefire. But it seemed that actually happened because the TPLF was gaining a lot of ground and essentially taking the Tigray area back. Well, the fighting has now expanded beyond Tigray, and it's reported the TPLF seized a town in the Afar area of Ethiopia, and then the ethnic group from that region was then mobilizing to get ready to go, to fight off those Tigrayan fighters. And then, just more recently, I addressed it on the last show, we had the Tigrayan fighters apparently breach another province and another ethnic group's territory in Ethiopia, this being the Amhara region, and now their youth are mobilizing for fighting against the TPLF. So this isn't, an area I'm as familiar with as Afghanistan necessarily, but I have had in the past on the show U.S. Army Major, former West Point instructor Danny Hale on to talk and break down what's happening in Ethiopia. So I feel like I have a pretty good handle on kind of the situation now, where it seems the fighting has spread well beyond Tigray, as the Tigrayans are a powerful ethnic group in Ethiopia and have been able to wage first a counterinsurgency successfully against the Ethiopian army to push them out, but now are looking at, either punishing the ethnic groups that participated in the fighting against Tigray, or looking to expand their territory and influence in the country. Now, not all the fighting is going on just between Tigray and other regions, the ethnic groups' armies, the neighboring countries' army, but apparently we now have reports of hundreds of civilians being killed in attacks in Ethiopia's Somali region, and this was reported by the local government in Ethiopia and also the Somali government. They say, ethnic militias from the Afar government attacked this area, border area with the Somali region of Ethiopia, and that's where all these civilians were killed. I couldn't find a whole lot of reporting going on about this, so I'm not sure if this had been an increasing situation with reprisals or potentially why these attacks are being carried out. But nonetheless, it seems like violence begets violence in Ethiopia, and what started out as, the government just routing one region and vanquishing one militia group seems to have spread to a lot more fighting. They're talking about potential famines in this region. This is the second most populous country in Africa, and so massive fighting and famines could lead to a lot more death than just those unfortunate, scores, hundreds, thousands that end up dead on the battlefield. Few more stories about Africa before I wrap up. The U.S. bombed Somalia for a second time in the week. It's reported that these are the first two airstrikes, at least the first two airstrikes carried out by the U.S. military against Somalia under the the Biden administration. Both times they claim to be targeting al-Shabaab and only killing civilians. Who knows that this is actually true? Under the Trump administration, we saw time and time again the administration would say we're only killing al-Shabaab, we're only killing al-Shabaab. But anytime any actual reporting came out of it, it turned out that a hell of a lot of civilians were being killed. In Tunisia, the president fired the prime minister, dismissed the parliament, and this is really key because Tunisia was one of the states that post Arab Spring came out freer and less violent than before. And so, the Arab Spring actually gets kicked off in Tunisia. The longtime dictator there, Ben Ali, is overthrown in a popular revolution. In 2014, they set up a democratic constitution that split powers between the president, prime minister, and parliament. And now they have the new president of the country, Karis Said, saying that he has essentially assumed all control over the government. Both sides are saying that basically the other is acting inappropriately according to the Constitution. It seems to me that, based on what I could see, the president is definitely abusing power here, but, I'm not there to make a call. This did warrant some pretty major protest in Tunisia, and all the Western media coverage I'm seeing has been that the protesters are anti the president's decision. Maybe this is a guy usurping power from a budding democracy. It could also be that this is just the Western media's narrative, and that's what's being reported in the English-speaking press so far. But it does seem that, there are some protesters who are upset with the president's decision. Last up here, we're talking about Mali, where a couple months ago we had another coup, where we now have interim president Assimi Golita as again the interim president, and somebody tried to kill him, and that person just died in the hospital in the custody of security forces. I mean, who knows? Maybe he tried to kill the president, took a couple bullets, bled out over a week, and died. That kind of thing happens. It could also be that, he was going to pull through, and the president's security forces said, nah, you don't take a run at our guy and then get to live to tell the tale about it or something like that. So, still a mess in Mali. And of course, all these situations are, I think, largely, first a result of the U.S. intervention. I mean, it was the WikiLeaks, the State Department cables released by Chelsea Manning, given to WikiLeaks, published by Julian Assange, that sparked the Arab Spring, that showed to the people of Africa that their leaders were not concerned at all for them, but were essentially bought and paid for by Western governments and were there to enrich themselves in the West. And, between that and the protests that, resulted from that and the Arab Spring spreading, but then particularly the U.S. intervention in Libya, killing Gaddafi, and, spreading this terrorist nightmare throughout West Africa and the Sahel region is, largely why you have the instability that you have now in Mali, Nigeria, where hundreds of people are being kidnapped. Nigeria, I think you had 2 attacks in the past week where over 10 people died. People on motorbikes show up in a village, start shooting, killing people, stealing everything, then taking off. Burkina Faso, a country that didn't have a jihadist problem until recently, still has a massive jihadist problem. Of course, there was recently a coup in Chad. All these countries have been touched by the U.S. war in Libya, and actually to point out 57 attempted refugees just drowned in the Mediterranean trying to sail from Libya to Italy. And so these are just more consequences of Obama's disastrous war in that country. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up for today. Hope everybody's, continent, I guess that would have been all of Africa, not just Libya. Wrap up for today. Hope everybody's enjoying the show. Make sure you share the show. Find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. Video version of the show at Rumble, Odyssey, and YouTube. Definitely check out the alternative platforms. Right now, again, we have Odyssey and Rumble. They're cracking down more and more on censorship. It's only a matter of time before more episodes get pulled on YouTube, and I hope people have other places that they're subscribed to and get the show for when that inevitably happens. Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter for social media platforms. Patreon Subscribestar to set up recurring fiat donations. If you would like to donate in crypto, I got Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash addresses in the show notes page. Show note pages are up everywhere you could listen to the shows. Also doing clips of the show again, longer clips this time, going to just be breaking down the show into the little chunks of the different subjects that I talked about. Probably 5 or 6, different clips per show. If you guys could share them, like them, comment, let me know what you think. I really appreciate it when people do that. Like, subscribe on all the different platforms, and just keep doing what you're doing. We have one of the best audiences. Me and Will are really excited about the what the show has become already and what we have planned for the future. I had to say I'm really excited for the interview I got planned for Friday's show. I think everybody's gonna absolutely love it. And so be back on Friday. Talk to you then.